Okay, we are looking at about 9 a.m. now, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our December Focus event. Today, we are going to be discussing trends for the future. This year has been unpredictable, to say the least, but there are a lot of learnings and takeaways that we can identify and use from this year now going into 2021, and how we can improve our businesses and really build on the foundation that we have, hopefully already started to put in place this year. Just a few notes. We are recording this presentation. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, and we will be sending it out to participants after the event. You can submit questions through the Q&A or through the chat function. We may not get to those through our program today, but we will follow up after the webinar and include any responses to common questions in the email follow-up after. As a quick disclaimer, this webinar and presentation is for informational purposes only. It is not legal advice. We always recommend that you consult with an attorney regarding your specific circumstances before taking or refraining from any action. Additionally, we are a law firm in the state of Washington. We are licensed to practice in the state of Washington. There are many areas of law that are governed both federally and through different states. And so our presentation, we primarily focus here on Washington law. We'll probably be mentioning some other states here and there, but to the extent that that other states apply to your business, or is governed, your business is governed by the jurisdictions of other states or localities, we won't be really addressing those in too much detail today. And yeah, so I guess we can go ahead and get started with our agenda. So today, here's the topics that we're going to be covering. First, we're going to take a look at DEI. Second, employee protections, and then we're going to move into remote work, which is obviously a big hot topic right now, commercial leasing, coronavirus 2.0 is what we're calling it, and the impact of PPP loans and consumer privacy and data security. Okay, so Michelle is going to kick us off here discussing our overarching trends shaping 2021.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. If those topics on that last slide sound familiar, it's because they are trends, and we have actually seen so much happening in these areas that you're probably actually tired of hearing about them. But what we want to look at today is how do we take what we learned this year through the tumultuous times, the constant change, and leverage that for a better 2021. So a couple of kind of key picture items to think about. The workplace has been reshaped by COVID-19, the racial injustice, Black Lives Matter movement. And what we're looking at for 2021 is, okay, what have we done? And what can we refine, polish, build on to do better? And then, of course, we've got a new administration, and we don't know, the specifics of what's going to be going on there, but we do know there will be plenty of regulatory changes. Some of them may be immediate, some of them over time, but it does create additional uncertainty as if we need some more. So what we want to cover is how do we leverage what we learned, and just some kind of thinking points for you as we go through this presentation. Look around your business and determine what's working, what's not working. What should be permanent? What are the things that we did that were like, hey, wait a minute, that is actually a really great tool for us going forward, and we should keep that. How's your business changed? How has your community changed? And we've heard a lot about the quote new normal. Well, we have an opportunity sometime this year, we hope, to go back to the old normal, but is that really what we want? And so keeping those things in the back of our minds as we talk through these memories from 2020 and how they're going to flow into 2021, what is it that we can do to really build on the silver linings that did pop up from time to time this year and grow that into a great 2021? So our first topic is diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace. This is not a new topic, but it certainly has a lot of heightened awareness this year with the racial injustice protests and that were following George Floyd's death. So let's talk a little about what it is and how it fits into your business for 2021. So DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's about creating a workplace that works for everyone. We did a full webinar on this in September that's on our YouTube page. So if you want more detail on what it is and how to make it work in your business, definitely go there. I am not the right person to get into the level of implementation of a great DEI program. But what we wanted to talk about is how has the idea of it and the awareness of it changed both employees and employers' perspectives on their business and their world. So if we think about, the three terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity is not only about, race and gender, which is typically, I think, where people go immediately with that word. Diversity is about differences in the workplace, differences of mindset, differences in experiences. And so that goes to age, ability, sexual orientation, religion, political viewpoint, as much as that can create its own problems. That diversity of thinking helps you to build a strong business. The world is diverse, your customers are diverse. And McKinsey studies, there was a study recently that showed that companies with gender diversity had 15% better results and ethnic diversity 35% better results in their business. And why is that? Because they're able to look at the world in a different way, and your business can look at its world in a different way. So we go to equity. Equity is different than equality. We've talked about equality for many, many years, but equity is really about ensuring that there's kind of an equal opportunity for participation, equal opportunity to succeed. That doesn't mean everyone has the same thing. It means they have the same opportunity. And so thinking about the way your business brings people together and allows them to participate, making sure that everybody has an opportunity to participate and be successful. And then inclusion gets toward the values and the belonging, the sense of belonging that an employee feels. So do you have certain types of policies, procedures, activities in your business that inadvertently exclude people? Whether that's food choices, dietary choices, whether that's holidays, whether different kinds of things that, if you think about your company in a big picture, are we creating an environment where everyone feels that they belong and they're welcome? So what we're seeing as far as the changes, we're kind of shifting from a diversity of just race and ethnicity to diversity of people. As I mentioned, this is a bigger concept than just finding groups that were historically underrepresented or held back, and rather looking holistically at what diversity means in our population. From equality to equity. Again, I talked a little bit about this a minute ago. Just because everyone has an equal tool doesn't mean that equal tool gives them the opportunity to succeed in the same way. Some of you may have seen the imagery online that's 3 different people with a box to stand on to see over the fence. That one box doesn't help everybody to have the same perspective on the world. And so thinking about what gives everybody an equal chance to succeed. And then the legal liability focus to a people focus. I don't want to say in any way that legal liability is not on the table here, but I think we've historically had a perspective of we don't talk about that. We don't talk about religion. We don't talk about sexual orientation. We don't talk about race because it could raise this big legal liability flag. And I think the idea with DEI is to focus on people and focus on the success of your people and an understanding of where they're coming from, what their experiences are, and how to make the workplace open, available, and a successful workplace for everyone. So the shifting legal focus is really on an awareness and accommodation. So what do we need to do to make a place that works for everyone? And alongside that, increase the education of what is unlawful activity. So for the future, a couple of just thoughts to keep in mind. What can you do in your organization to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion? Go through your handbooks and your policies. And are there areas where, maybe the way that something's phrased, the way that our professional attire language is phrased, does that inadvertently exclude certain people? When we think about how we create opportunity for advancement, do we inadvertently create opportunities for certain groups rather than others because of the way we think about the world? DEI as a policy is a commitment from the top. It is not a check the box. It is not a document. It is a mindset. And so something like this is really important, but it's also a chance for the company as a whole to take action. And then the last piece, as far as next steps and things to think about, anti-harassment training has become something that is a real benefit. We've had a couple of clients who've had issues been raised after they have had anti-harassment training conducted in their workplace. It really opens the door for the employees to feel confident that it will be taken seriously and that they are respected. So training and ensuring that your employee base is comfortable with not only what's on paper, but the reality of your organization's activities. So I want to put up a quick poll as I wrap up this section. What actions, if any, has your business taken this year to address the racial injustice issues?
Okay, the poll is currently launched. So I'll give you guys about 10 or so seconds to respond.
I should have included a none of the above here because not everyone has taken action. We've been a little distracted.
Okay, all right, couple more seconds. All right, we're gonna end the poll. I'm gonna share results.
Yeah, so this is great. I mean, what we've seen is businesses that are looking at how can we create a workplace that responds to this challenge in our community. And it's great to see so much action. And again, for those of you who are looking at DEI related programs, go back to our September focus event with Ann Dorgan. It really provides a lot of context around how to do this in a much deeper way than what I've provided today.
Okay, so our next subject here is going to be employee protections. This area is actually a continuing trend that we've seen over a number of years. It's remained steady that we're seeing the story of more. Employees are gaining more and more protections in the workplace, and that is true in multiple contexts, and in this year is no different. A few concrete examples of where we are seeing this trend play out is just more, generally more protections, as well as just more flexibility. And we're seeing actually a lot more competition now. I mean, with the employment landscape being what it is right now, we might not have fully seen that shift yet, but once employees really start going back to work and we start getting those unemployment numbers down, we're going to start seeing a lot of competition, just given the new remote work environment, which we're also going to discuss here in a few minutes. So before I get started, I'm going to ask Hillary to launch a poll on this topic. And we'll get a feel for what types of benefits and changes that you all have made to your workplaces. So what employee protections and benefits have you implemented or do you plan to implement in your workplace?
Okay, the poll is currently launched. I'm going to give about 15 or so seconds for everybody to read the questions and answer.
Great, yeah, and I'll kind of get started with talking through some of the protections that we are seeing while you all take your poll. So some of the protections that we're seeing play out include increases in protected classes. When we, like Michelle kind of mentioned before, that when we think of protected classes, we tend to think of, race, gender, religion, those types of things, age. And so what we're seeing is actually increases in protected classes. One in particular is the Crown Act that has been passed in a number of different states now, including in Washington, which protects employees from discrimination based on hairstyles or hair texture that are typically associated with race. And that includes, for example, afros, braids, dreadlocks. And so, employers are now prohibited from taking negative employment actions against employees or candidates based on those types of characteristics. So if we want to go ahead and wrap up the poll here and see what our results look like. Okay, so what we are seeing a significant amount of stipends and reimbursement for ergonomic equipment. This is just sort of one area where we've got folks who are working from home. Maybe they're working from their couches, maybe they're working from their beds. If they, maybe they they're kind of making it work in terms of having kids at home. So we see a lot of flex working hours. So we see a small number of employers who are providing childcare assistance. I think that's going to continue to be an issue, whether kids are in school or out of school, and whether parents feel comfortable sending their kids to school. So yeah, absolutely. It looks like there's a lot of folks who are making some changes. Okay, so picking back up where we left off here, so the Crown Act, we are seeing that, this area of sort of sweeping legislation across a number of states. And so that's just going to continue to increase and continue to be a movement that, that folks are pushing for. Some other areas of protections that we're seeing as just trends across the United States includes paid family medical leave. Just this year, Washington implemented the benefits portion of our paid family medical leave program. So we started collecting premiums last year, and this year has been the first time that employees were actually able to collect on those benefits. Again, we're seeing this in California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, you name it. There are a lot of states that are picking up paid family medical leave programs. Oregon is another one that we'll start to see that the benefits become available in January of 2023, Colorado in 2024. So we'll just keep on seeing that trend continue across the United States. We've also seen increases in, for example, paid sick leave laws. Here in the state of Washington, we have Washington Sick and Safe, as well as local laws like Seattle Sick Leave, which provide greater protection. So we just want to make sure that we're staying on top of any changes in those areas. Another area where we're seeing expanded protections is in pay transparency and equal pay. In Washington and other states, we've seen salary history bans, as well as laws that require employers to disclose the minimum salary or a salary range. In Washington, it's if an applicant or a candidate that's been selected and received a job offer requests that information. So that really kind of hinges on the employer has to really think through before they post a position and begin hiring for a position that we've actually have made that internal determination and documented that. We're also seeing increases in employee notification requirements. This is one that kind of is easy to miss, but we've always had our workplace posters that we need to, that we post up in the break room, for example. That becomes a little more challenging in a remote work environment because we may not have a break room where employees are regularly visiting. So we've kind of maybe had to figure out a digital mechanism to make those workplace rights available to our employees. But in addition to that, we have seen some laws that require notices to employees outside of the context of just the posters. So for example, Oregon has a law that restricts non-competes and requires that employees be notified within a certain amount of time of termination of any non-compete limitations that exist. Washington has notice requirements when an employee is potentially eligible for paid family medical leave. So we want to make sure that we're aware of any of those employee notification requirements and have the processes in place and really start to make sure that that has trickled through all of our, the management and the folks who need to be aware of it. So we're just seeing, increased activity in that space, and that's just kind of being built into some other pieces of legislation. And then, of course, we have health and safety. So this is a big one. COVID. Here we are. We're washing hands, more than we've ever washed before. We've maybe changed our workplaces up to change occupancy limits of certain spaces, or we've removed communal food. We've taken steps in terms of health and safety, and that's going to, that will not, I don't expect that to change. COVID is still a thing going into 2021. And just generally, I think that it's made folks more aware of their obligations as an employer to maintain a safe and healthy workplace for their employees. So I think that we can expect that to continue even after the effects of COVID have died down. Just this heightened awareness will continue to be a ripple effect even after COVID, just because of our mindsets that have dramatically shifted in this area. And then finally, again, thanks to COVID, we've seen the reality of the new remote workplace. And so more and more employees have an expectation and potentially a need for things like flexibility, both in workplace location and hours. Employees are still juggling a lot of uncertainty and responsibilities outside of work, including childcare and the challenges that come alongside that. Maybe we are hearing dogs barking in the background on our Zoom calls. And so, just some of those softer elements of employment, and how do we keep morale high and really meet our employees where they're at, recognizing that everyone is really bringing their full selves to the workplace these days. And then finally, competition. So, as we start to see people going back to work, we know that employers now are putting in place the infrastructure to hire employees almost anywhere. And so what does that look like for us and for the hiring landscape when we're seeking employees or trying to keep our current strong employees? There's now this increased hiring pool that employers can look to. So where you might not have otherwise had the infrastructure to hire an employee in Oregon, then now you might have that. And so what does that mean? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, because there are some additional complications that I will speak to and we want to be aware of. But this, opening up of the hiring pool can translate to increased competition for strong candidates. And so, it's being aware of what benefits do we need to put in place to, really remain competitive and to, keep our strongest employees and keep morale high. All right, so that's a great transition into our next subject of remote work. So for this topic, the analogy that I would like to give is, maybe a strange analogy, but the analogy of roughing out a piece, wood carving, for example. In this case, we were forced to take a look at our workplace and say, okay, we've got all of these restrictions now because of the emergency orders that we can't be in person. And so we were forced to put policies in place or forced to transition to a remote work environment very quickly. And so we didn't necessarily do that with an eye towards, intentionality and strategy. It was out of a need. And so now we have an opportunity to take another look and say, is this something that we want to continue and really build out those policies so that they work for us in a sustainable way, and that we have really thought through it and made it our own and made it work for our employees as much as possible. So going into 2021, we'll be thinking about some things like, do we even want to have remote work on an ongoing basis? Is our business that type of business where it makes sense to do that? And do our employees, expect it, want it? Is it working? Is it not working? So some of those considerations, and maybe I'll have Hillary launch the poll right now as I kind of start looking into what those considerations look like. Sure. Thank you.
Okay, the poll is launched.
So this is a simple poll. Do you plan to adopt a long-term or permanent telework policy?
Right. We have almost everyone. All right, I'm going to end the poll.
Okay, so we've got a big number here. 75% of us are looking to adopt a long-term or permanent telework policy. That tells us a lot. And so when we're doing that, what are some of the things that we need to be aware of and some of the considerations that we need to take into account when we are putting in place or really supporting our long-term or permanent telework policies? So some of those include, do we want to do it at all? Of course, is the first question. The second question is, in what capacity do we want to do that? Are we going to be a remote first workplace, or are we going to be a remote friendly workplace? So, in this case, I think, a lot of folks had remote friendly policies in place even before COVID, where, employees could take one Friday a month, for example, to work from home. But is that going to be sort of what we continue? Or are we going to, is it going to be a couple of days a month or a couple of days a week? Or are employees going to be expected to be working from home as a default, and maybe just have an office space that's available if they choose to come into the office, or if there's, an all hands meeting or some other reason for them to come into the office. So that's one question that we'll definitely want to be aware of. Also, if we are sort of remote friendly, what kind of approvals or arrangements does an employee need to make, and what efforts need to be taken in order to establish that arrangement? Flexible work hours and locations. I think the key with remote work is that, we don't want our employees to be out of sight, out of mind. So what we want to make sure we do is set expectations and, have some level of accountability with our employees who are teleworking. Is there an expectation that they are online certain hours of the day? Do they need to be available between the hours of 9 and 5? Or, is it okay for them to have flexible work hours? Are they expected to respond to emails or messages within a certain period of time? So what are the expectations that we have for our employees in communicating those? We did also have another webinar previously on sort of the concept of employment. And I think we've also, we've put out some blog posts and things like that on the subject of remote work. So we've got a little bit more information that you can find on our website. Out-of-state employees. Now, this is a big one, and it's really one that we're seeing come up a lot and with more and more frequency. Many employees are saying, I want to go work from Hawaii for a month, or I am going to move closer to my family in Bend, Oregon, for example. So there's a lot of different situations that we want to look at on a case-by-case basis. And maybe, since employees assume that since I'm already working remotely, it's fine. It doesn't matter where I work from. That may not be the case. So that's a question. Is it fine? Employers will need to take certain factors into consideration before saying, yes, that's fine. So having an employee working from another state, a business is going to have to consider two big questions. One, at what point are you now an employer in that state if you weren't already? And two, does having an employee in that state create economic nexus, which is sort of a tax concept, but it's an important one. So it kind of becomes a question of risk tolerance and viewing each situation on a case-by-case basis. So for example, the employee who wants to work from Hawaii for a month, well, that's probably a low risk. In this case, the employee, if they're a Washington resident, is still a resident of Washington, and they are planning to come back to the state of Washington. All of the work is being performed remotely for an employer that's in the state of Washington, so maybe we're not that concerned about that. But it becomes a little bit harder of a question when the employee says, well, I'm going to go, and be closer to my family for the next 6 months. Okay, well, what does that look like? At that point, is the employee, if the employee, for example, is working out of Bend, Oregon for the next 6 months, and we are now at the 6 month, we've been in COVID world for more than 6 months now. So what does that look like? At what point do the tables start to turn and say, okay, well, this is looking more like a permanent work situation? Or more like the employee is maybe a resident of that state. And so at what point do we really need to start considering tax and employment implications of that? And then of course, when we start to have employees say, I'm just going to be moving, I'm going to move to Montana, or I'm going to move to Oregon, or I'm going to move to Arizona. Okay, well, do you already have employees in that state? And if not, then we need to make sure that we're taking a look at all of the requirements in order to be an employer in that state. So every state is going to be different. We're going to want to make sure that we view that state's, usually the Secretary of State website, to see what the requirements are to register as an employer. And, for example, Oregon has income tax. So what kind of tax implications? Talk to your CPAs before you really start to make any decisions there. And then, of course, every state has its own employment laws. So, like I was kind of talking a little bit about that earlier, Washington has paid family medical leave. There's state and local other paid leave laws. There's, differences in discrimination laws. And so we want to make sure that we're aware of any differences that exist in those states, and that we are prepared, to implement policies in those states. For example, if you have an employee handbook for employers who have employees in multiple states, a lot of times what we're recommending is that you have addenda that apply to each state. So any of those state-specific areas or areas that differ by jurisdiction, that we address those in unique addenda for each state. Okay, moving on. So in the spirit of remote work, we will continue to see businesses invest in tools and infrastructure in the area of technology and continue to support and enhance remote work. This also begs the question of cybersecurity. So of course, it's important to protect your business's confidential and proprietary information, including your employees' information. Steps like adopting a VPN, password management, centralized network controls, access rights, regular phishing training. These are all exercises and some tools that you can implement to increase increase your cybersecurity and awareness. And then, of course, this is more of a not necessarily a legal issue, but continuing to foster that connection and the culture. I think it's really easy when we're just sort of on Zoom calls all day to lose the connection that you might have had when employees were passing each other in the hallways or eating lunch together in the break room. And so how do we continue to maintain that culture and to foster the connection so that we maintain the morale? And I think that it just brings a lot to the work environment to make sure that our employees have a chance to connect. And I think as humans, we really crave that connection. Okay, so our next subject here, on the subject of remote work, it also begs the question of leasing. So in this, I'm going to deem this as the story of recovery. Tenants, business tenants are continuing to struggle under economic pressure in this area. Landlords and tenants are continuing to have to find creative solutions to work through the reality that is, many tenants have seen significant impacts to their revenues this year because of COVID. Just for example, a coffee shop in the city of Seattle that previously relied on the comings and goings of the many employees in downtown might not have been able to make it, or might have really struggled to make their rent payments, or not been able to make them at all. And so landlords and tenants have had to work together to find solutions to that new dynamic and power shift. And so you might be in one of two buckets. You might be a tenant with an existing lease, who has seen the impacts of COVID, and how does that, what rights do you have under your current lease? Or you might be a tenant who's considering a new lease or renewing your existing lease. And so what does that look like? So the first question, of course, if you have an existing lease, is do we keep our lease at all? Do you know when your lease is up? And if so, if your lease is going to be up now or in the near future, are you planning to keep your lease? So I think a lot of folks said that they're planning to have permanent or long-term remote work. And so does that mean that, maybe it doesn't make sense for us to have the overhead of a leased space? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. For folks whose leases are not up anytime soon, but they have decided to make the shift to a fully remote work environment, do you have the options to assign or sublet your space to another tenant? And what do you need to do in order to make that happen? And are there other tenants to be had? I think that's the other challenge right now, is that there's not a lot of other tenants out there necessarily looking right now, but you can get lucky. And I have seen landlords make accommodations for that. Lease modification. So, as we're going into a new world, do we have, changes that we need to make to our payment structure? So, for example, the city of Seattle and other jurisdictions, including King County, have put in place some protections, especially for small business tenants, like eviction moratoriums and legislation that prohibits landlords from, enforcing personal guarantees, or legislation that requires landlords to negotiate payment schedules for repaying any back rent that tenants have not been able to pay on time. And so, are we going to make modifications to our leases or to our payment schedules to accommodate that? Another consideration is if your workplace is going to look different this year, if you are going to move away from the individual offices or cubicles, and maybe we want to have more flex space. Do you need tenant improvement allowances? So as you're renewing your lease, maybe that is something that you want to consider asking for. Is having some level of landlord contribution to transitioning your space to allow for more of that flex space working environment. So maybe that means moving some walls, or maybe that means making other physical changes to your workplace. And then, of course, tenants considering new leases or changing spaces, what we're seeing is shorter term leases. We used to see, tenants who wanted a lot of certainty and were signing 7 or 10-year leases, and, really seeing the benefit of that in terms of certainty in, the rent rates and things like that on a long-term basis. But now, the priority is really short-term, cash flow. And so seeing shorter term leases and not wanting to really commit ourselves to 10 years because there's just so much uncertainty in the economic landscape today. Additionally, creative rent structures. So where, instead of base rent, if we're in, for example, a restaurant or retail, maybe we're moving towards more of a percentage revenue-based rent structure. And then lastly, we're seeing, there are a lot of, spaces that are not in as high demand, like office spaces, for example, but there are other spaces that are in much greater demand, like warehouse space. So if you are in the market for warehouse space, you might see some challenges there, just given that there's so much online shopping going on these days. All right, I'm going to kick it off to Michelle to talk about coronavirus 2.0. And what does that mean, Michelle?
Well, I know this is a topic that no one's heard enough about this year. So I want to spend time again on, what did we learn and how do we move forward? The quote that, many of you probably have heard, we're all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. I think that really, resonates. We've all come across companies that have seen a very, very different story than our story this year. A couple examples. I know two companies that were kind of based in the travel and hospitality business that completely changed their business models in order to manage through this, and finding a way in spite of the odds. Savor Seattle Food Tours started pulling together Pike Place Market. They used to do tours of Pike Place Market. Pulled together Pike Place Market vendors and did boxes locally and now nationally of those food products, and also contributing to the Pike Place Market Foundation. So they found a way to take the connections, the network, the business that they had, and do something different. And similarly, the Table Less Traveled did international food tours, and she's now bringing international chefs into your kitchen via Zoom for these amazing food experiences. So the resilience and the fortitude of our community is truly inspiring. And another visible example of that is the community-centered support and solutions. When everything is collapsing all around us, and you see, a company like Gourmando that does catering, partnering with Amazon and Fair Start to provide meals to frontline workers and folks who are struggling with either homelessness or poverty through this pandemic. It's really inspiring to just sort of see how the community comes together at a time when it feels like there's very little hope. So the fortitude piece really resonates with me, and we saw a lot of really amazing stories that came out of the last 9 months. So from a what do you need to do standpoint, the rules were changing day by day. We built things we had never built before. We did things that we've never done before. Our business changed in ways that we couldn't even imagine a year ago. We wouldn't even want to imagine a year ago. And now we're at a place where it's like, okay, what do we do? And a big thing that we're starting to see is the enforcement of policies. We actually had a client recently that was undergoing an audit with respect to their COVID policies. We also saw a small online retailer that received a lawsuit for ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act compliance for their website. So they shifted from solely retail to putting all their stuff online. And there's a few lawyers around the country that are coming after small retailers who don't have compliance with respect to ADA on their websites. So you're starting to see, some of the repercussions of our immediate reaction, our immediate pivot, our immediate jump into whatever we can jump into in order to make this work. So I think now's the time to take a step back and say, okay, what have we done? What's permanent? And what do we need to shore up in order to make this work? So compliance from a coronavirus standpoint specifically, you must have a written policy. If you don't have one, you need to get one. Because when an employee or a customer or somebody goes and complains, they're going to come in and they're going to say, let us see what you've done. Do you have signs? Do you have enforcement? Are your employees wearing masks? Do you require customers to wear masks? All those things are going to show up. And the likelihood may be low, but you want to be ready for that. On a separate topic is the leave benefits. So under the FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, there were additional leave benefits that were provided. And that results, if your employees use that, you get a tax credit on the back end. So you need to make sure you're tracking those leave benefits separately from other leave benefits, whether those are state provided or company provided, so that you can very clearly obtain those tax credits when the time comes without a whole lot of back and forth and cost and complexity to that. Another area that I said fortitude, flexibility is the other one. As I mentioned, we did things this year that we would never have imagined a year ago. So how do we think about what this looks like going forward? Ashley talked about remote work. We talked about DEI. We talked about, what does the workplace look like right now with your employees being remote or your employees being in person with all of the safety infrastructure. To me, the big lesson here to carry forward is business continuity. So we went through this panic, we went through this disaster, at least by some book standards. What did we learn? What are the things that our business is dependent on that we have shifted now, and can we create a more robust, better disaster recovery plan or business continuity plan? Because we know that our insurance isn't going to step in. We know how our employees struggled or how our customers struggled in order to work together. So we're in a position now to take that information and to create some infrastructure for the next time. The next time may not look exactly the same, but the next time we'll be there and we're better equipped at this point to take advantage of that. The other piece that I would mention is know where to find credible resources for information. If you guys remember, March, April, May, there was information coming at us from every angle, what was going to happen, what might happen, what didn't happen, what did happen. And when it came out, it was unclear. So find those places where are reliable sources for information so that you can go very quickly and say, here's what I need to do when something changes, because it will change again. A great example is going to be, we've got a vaccine coming. Well, what do we do with that? Are we allowed to require our employees to take it? What if they don't want to? All of these different things that are going to look similar to the experiences we've had this year are going to come forward next year. So we want to be ready for that, because change in this environment is still teed up and ready to go. So our next topic is around government action and PPP loans. So many of us, many of our colleagues and fellow business owners in desperate need of help as this started to collapse around us. And we saw government step in, and that was in desperate need. So we had the FFCRA, which is the Family's First Coronavirus Relief Act, and the CARES Act, and the PPP loans. All of those things came in to give us much needed support for our businesses. And where we are now is in a place of reconciling our documentation so that we can take advantage of those benefits. So I mentioned on the last slide, the leave options, they're tax credits for the FFCRA benefits. So make sure you clearly tracked that and that you have a way of communicating with your CPA. Here's what we used, here's who used it, here's how they used it, and here's the amount that should be taken as a tax credit. So just make sure that you understand kind of how those two things played together. Now, if they took state leave, if they took paid family medical in Washington, that's not what this is. This is under the extensions of leave at the federal level under the FFCRA. The second piece was the PPP, which is very, very visible. We have a lot of conversation right now about forgiveness. And so companies are working with their banks to determine, when and what they need to do in order to process their forgiveness of their PPP loans. So work with your lender and make sure that you know the timing for your forgiveness. Generally, you have 10 months from the time you use the money, and what they require for you to submit to them. What's the mechanism for submission, and what is the process if it's insufficient? So just work with them and make sure that you understand what they need so that it's seamless the first time. If your loan was more than $2 million, there are these necessity questionnaires. And this is what I would call a lesson learned. On the application, there was a certification by the business that said, we need this money in order to continue operations. And almost everybody could check that box and say, yep, absolutely. But But they're asking more questions now for folks who had over $2 million in PPP loans. So they have to actually show and demonstrate how they needed it. So this is important, I think, as we consider future PPP extensions or future grants that may come from the government. There's still a lot of changing in guidance from the SBA and the Treasury Department. So this is not carved in stone. There's this right now guidance that anything you spent the money on is not a tax deductible tax expense for this year. So there's a timing issue of 21, 20 versus 20. And there's also an issue of, is that going to change? The expectation was that Congress was going to adjust that, but that hasn't happened, and it might. So if you file for your forgiveness now, and they make additional changes next year, what does that mean for your bookkeeping, your accounting, your taxes? So, you know, it may or may not, depending on who your CPA is, may or may not be prudent to be the first in line to apply for forgiveness. You have time, and so does it make sense to do that? Make sure your documentation's in place. Make sure you understand the implications of the current guidance, the current expectation versus what are the possible alternatives and what is the likelihood of those happening. So in addition, right now, of course, with the new restrictions, keep your eye out for grants out there from the state and city governments. I know that there are a lot of businesses out there that these new extended restrictions are really impacting, again, restaurants, retail, especially. So keep an eye out for those opportunities. They are small, but in some cases, every dollar helps. And we do anticipate additional stimulus package after the first of the year. We don't know what that's going to look like for sure. If you read the news, you know that McConnell in the Senate has certain requirements, and that the House does have a bill that they passed. Something I find kind of interesting is that one of the requirements on the Senate side is a liability protection for businesses, which is, when you look at it from a big picture standpoint, maybe not all that popular in the broader audience. But as a business owner, and you think about what you've gone through this year, and you think about how hard you work to try to make it safe, but the rules were changing every day, kind of is a little bit of a deep breath of protection that maybe that is a helpful tool for businesses, because it's not, at least for those of us in the small business world, it's not about trying to avoid responsibility, but rather, how much we could reasonably do with the information and the timing and the situation we were in. So, so that may show up in some way, shape, or form in the new package as well. And then, as I mentioned just earlier, read the fine print. If the PPP is extended and you're going to take it, I know that the current expectation is it's going to be limited to businesses that truly are impacted in the longer term. But as we saw with the current PPP, the rules changed. Everyone jumped in, applied for it, and then was like, oh yeah, and by the way, necessity questionnaires. Oh yeah, and by the way, non-deductibility. So try to get a sense for what is known and what are the possibilities for that if you're going to go ahead and proceed with additional assistance.
Okay, so our next topic here is going to be consumer privacy and data security. This is really the story of prudence and vigilance. What we're seeing here is a more aggressive patchwork of state legislation. And so, maybe if you have some kind of a presence in the EU, for example, you might be familiar with the GDPR, which went into place in May of 2018. And then just this past January, we saw the California Consumer Privacy Act go into place in California, which was sort of the closest that we had here in the United States to the GDPR. So what we're seeing is just more activity in that space. Just as the ink was drying on the CCPA, the California Privacy Rights Act was just passed. And so that looks even more so like the GDPR. And we are continuing to see more and more and more action in this space, including right here in the state of Washington. The Washington Privacy Act is now in its third year of proposal. It has failed twice before. And so, all eyes are on Washington to see what's going to happen this year, and if they're finally going to be able to make it happen this year. Some of the more controversial terms that are problematic in getting these laws through the legislature and sort of having them stalled is whether there's going to be a private consumer right of action, which means can consumers sue companies or businesses for having a data breach or for otherwise violating one of these consumer privacy laws? Can that happen in addition to whatever statutory and other types of penalties that are implemented in that law? So, with this increase of, additional states starting to take more action in the area of privacy, including Washington, New York, Nevada, just keeps on adding up and adding up, is that we start to see this really difficult landscape for businesses, especially small businesses, to comply with, because you've got 50 different laws, to be aware of, and they're all slightly different. And so really, understanding your liability becomes a huge challenge that is really insurmountable, especially for small businesses. Larger businesses that can afford, teams of lawyers and things like that, like the Facebooks of the world, they're concerned about it, certainly, and it's a liability for them, certainly, but they have the money to deal with it, and they have the resources to deal with it, whereas small businesses just don't have that luxury necessarily. So, from a practical standpoint, any attorney would tell you to implement the most restrictive or the most protective practices that you can. That is easier said than done, of course, and that also has costs associated with it. But so all eyes are on Congress really to take federal action so that there is some relief in this sort of increased patchwork of legislation, so that we have one overarching United States privacy law. And I it's to be determined whether that will happen. There have been some efforts made. We have seen a couple of different proposals, so whether any of those will gain traction is still yet to be seen. What I would encourage businesses to do, however, is to be proactive in this space, even if it's not something that you are required to do. So even if the California Consumer Privacy Act, for example, does not apply to you, or even if the Washington Privacy Act is not passed this year, there might be some steps that you want to take simply because your business, your assets are, your confidential business information, your proprietary information. And of course, nobody wants to be in the news for a data breach if you are one of those businesses that collects consumer data or stores consumer data. So being proactive in this area of what kind of security measures do we need to be taking, and would it be wise to take? So, what we're required to do is one question, and what is wise to do is another question. And so really being aggressive, because, the folks who are working to steal your information or to, launch phishing attacks against your company to try and, get money from you, this is their full-time job. They have nothing else to be doing but trying to find ways to scam you and your employees. And so, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? How do we put up protective measures to make sure that, for example, an employee doesn't get a phony email that looks like it's from the CEO that encourages them or tells them or instructs them to transfer money from the corporate bank account? What kind of mechanisms do we need to put in place to prevent that from happening? Because that's happening more and more and more often, and the scammers are getting more and more sophisticated. So to the extent that we can take steps to guard against that would be an investment well spent. And then finally, Michelle already mentioned ADA accessibility. So this is important for a couple of reasons. One is the California Consumer Privacy Act, for example, has built in an accessibility requirement with respect to the privacy policies and privacy notices that are required under that law. So even where there has been some uncertainty in the law on whether the ADA applies to, for example, all online businesses that don't have any kind of a physical presence, brick and mortar presence, those laws now are, even if you weren't necessarily required to make your website ADA accessible, or if you didn't believe that you were, you might now at least be required to make your privacy policy accessible and your California privacy notices accessible. And so making sure that we understand when those laws apply to us, and just generally speaking, it's also just a good thing to do for for equity purposes. And then the other area that we're seeing again a lot of increased activity in is consumer rights groups that are filing serial lawsuits or sending out serial letters to businesses for failure to comply with the ADA. And whether or not that claim is really grounded in reality, or whether that claim is really bona fide or likely to succeed in a courtroom, becomes immaterial, because nobody wants to end up in court over an ADA claim. And so what happens is businesses settle. I mean, they settle for however many thousands of dollars it takes to make it go away. And so, to the extent that we can guard against that as well, is a good thing. So those are just some of the areas, and I've listed just a few of the legislative activity that we're seeing in this space. But again, that just continues to increase and to change every day. So just staying on top of it as best we can, and when needed, seeking professional assistance, whether from legal counsel or from security consultants. Okay, so that's the last of our topics today. Now, we're at 9:55, so we're going to wrap up here. We do have upcoming focus webinars. This is something that we do every single month. You can see our past focus webinars on our website if you go to our events page. We do have upcoming focus webinars in 2021, in January, February, and March. So you can see the topics here. Go to our website for more information on those. Our focus webinars are always complimentary, free registration. And so we just enjoy, bringing value to our community through these events. And we just enjoy also connecting with you guys, through these events. So check those out if that's something you're interested in. If you do have any questions, feel free to send them to us either over email. You can see, again, myself and Michelle on our people page on our website. So you can feel free to shoot us an email, or just to contact at equinoxbusinesslaw.com, and we'll respond to your questions as best we can. If we did get any questions in the chat or through the Q&A, we will address those in our follow-up email. And then we'll also be sending out this slide deck as well. So we do have a list of resources here at the end, and including a few of our blog posts that are sort of relevant to some of the topics that we've discussed today. And Michelle, you're on mute.
I'm glad it reminds me.
Yeah.
And thank you. As we wrap up, I wanted to say thanks to everyone for joining us. I know a number of you guys are regular attendees at our focus events, and we really appreciate your input on the topics. If you have ideas for topics, please drop them either into the chat before you jump off, or drop us an email. I also wanted to mention, if you haven't participated in our business health assessment, now's a great time to do it. We've covered a bunch of topics today, and if any of them sort of pique your interest on how do I implement that in my business, our business health assessment is an hour of your time where we go through what's going right in your business, what are you struggling with, and help you to prioritize projects for you to tackle to build a strong infrastructure and mitigate risk in your business going forward. So if you're interested in learning more about the business health assessment, please reach out to either Ashley or me, and we'd be happy to give you more information and get that scheduled. So happy holidays, and wishing everybody a very happy new year.